Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 110th New Social Environment. My name is Catherine, and I have the absolute pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation with Carol Becker, Gordon Knox, Dewey Crumpler, John Priola, led by Dory Bowen. We're also thrilled to have the poet Marie Buck here, who will read to close today's program. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we are on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Sells, and Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter and will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our panelists today, we'd like to take a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's panelists. Carol Becker is Professor of the Arts and Dean of Columbia University School of the Arts, and she is the author of numerous articles and several books. Dewey Crumpler is an Associate Professor of Painting at San Francisco Art Institute. His current work examines issues of globalization and cultural co-modification through the integration of digital imagery, video, and traditional painting techniques. Gordon Knox is an educator, cultural innovator, and an institution builder. He conceptualizes and builds cultural institutions that support artists as agents of social change. John Priola has taught at San Francisco Art Institute for 24 years and is represented by Anglem Gilbert Gallery, Joseph Bellows Gallery, and Weston Gallery. Our host today, Dory Bowen, writes on modern and contemporary art, focusing on practices that probe the texture of ordinary life with new methods of creative production and distribution. She is also Associate Professor of Art History at San Jose State University. Without further ado, I will give the virtual stage to you, Dory.
Thanks, Catherine. And thank you to the Brooklyn Rail, to Fong for taking this roundtable, and to Connie Llewellyn for suggesting the Brooklyn Rail. It's a great team of people. I'm just going to spend a moment framing the idea of this roundtable. The San Francisco Art Institute is our point of departure for this roundtable concerning the struggles, challenges, and possibilities that face art schools and programs today. San Francisco Art Institute is one of the finest and oldest art education institutions in the country, having opened in 1871 for artists who paid monthly dues of $1. And it has been at the center of many important art movements such as the Beats, the West Coast Poets, Abstract Expressionism, Bay Area Figurative Painting, Performance Video, the F64 Photography Group, and more recently the Mission School. On March 23rd, a letter went out announcing the closure of the San Francisco Art Institute. $19 million in debt. The school was slated to merge with the University of San Francisco. The talks failed, and on March 24th, the New York Times reported that this, quote, once storied school was over. The arts community was devastated, but also impassioned. Many gathered remotely for town halls, a student-led counterinsurgency formed, the Alumni Association rallied, and on June 9th, the Committee to Reimagine SFAI was announced. On July 23rd, the SF News reported that despite not being out of the woods financially, the school's board recently reached an agreement to rehire tenured faculty, and it says it has already heard from students who want to return. The layoffs, however, continue and the students' return is unsure. The situation is compounded by the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests in response to the killing of George Floyd, all of this creating a perfect storm that many artists, scholars, and educators feel is the right moment to ask hard questions about art schools and programs. Each art school has its own scent, its own myth, its own ghosts. I taught at SFAI for a short time, and I recall the sound of bouncing sound off the concrete walls, the smell of the studios, the light, the people, the view. Like individuals, they're all unique. In this spirit, I wanted to now just show a few images that I've taken from an archive that Jeff Gunderson has been putting together and circulating in honor of the 150th anniversary of SFAI and during a very difficult time. So this first here is the San Francisco Art Association Bulletin, the first issue, which features a photo of the new library and a letter by the board president announcing the visit of Henri Matisse, as well as urging support from the public to expand their activities. The second image is a 2002 installation by a BFA student named Ben Wood, who projected a stereoscopic video installation opposite the Diego Rivera 1931 making of a fresco, which is in the campus gallery. And you can see that he's inserted contemporary educators into the scene. The third is a fresco by a student named Una McCann, which is painted in the school cafe. She was Diego Rivera's assistant and the only woman to be allowed to draw on the Bay Bridge while it was being constructed. The next image is the floorboards in the studios, the hardwood oak, which Gunderson writes, felt the footsteps of Frida Kahlo, Henri Matisse, Janis Joplin, Marcel Duchamp, Hillary Clinton, Angela Davis, Jerry Garcia, Carol Doda, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Courtney Love. The next image is of Kathy Acker, who is a very important writer, artist, punk, and biker, who was hired by Howard Freed to teach in the new performance video program in 1980. She was an inspiration to students, but also the entire community. The next image is of a piece by Eleanor Coppola, who worked with Lynn Hirschman on her famous Dante Hotel, which was considered one of the first site-specific pieces that took place in hotel rooms. The next is David Johnson, who studied with Ansel Adams from 1946 to 49. He was one of the first photographers to document the Fillmore district in San Francisco. And he also, this from the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. The next image is of Jay DeFeo. Well, it's of her rose, the famous rose, which was behind a wall in the seminar room from 1970 until 1995, when the Whitney curator Lisa Phillips had it excavated and restored. The next image, Gunderson celebrated gay pride with this image of Kehinde Wiley's 2018 presidential portrait of Barack Obama. He received his BFA from the Art Institute in 1999. And the last image is of George Kuchar, a photo taken by Fawn Yerby in 1989. And Gunderson writes, any day you crossed paths with George Kuchar, the charismatic filmmaker, actor, writer, director, painter, was a good day. So now I'd like to kick off the discussion with our participants, starting with Carol, then John, Dewey, and Gordon, and ask them to explain what they think is lost when an art school closes. That could be the Art Institute, but it could also be any art school. Are we being sentimental when we mourn the possibility of loss, and what exactly are we hoping to save? Carol?
Sure. I'm gonna go backwards a little bit to go forwards. So art schools are really completely utopian environments. They believe very much like the way Black Mountain College talked about, you know, leap before you look. Just let's take a chance. Let's make something happen. And the San Francisco Art Institute is a historic institution, very much like the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which I know very well because I was the dean for many years there, and very much like Cooper Union, sort of an amazing place that Peter Cooper opened in 1859. And one of Peter Cooper's main missions, apart from creating, apart from creating equity so that everyone could go to school for free, he also wanted a place that women could go to school. So these are sites of incredible radicality, and they've been around for a long time. Let me just take some water, it'll help. So one of the things I wanted to say is that people make a lump together the notion of art education and educating artists. And I want to say that educating artists is very particular. And that's what these institutions do. They really make the next generation of creative people possible to enter the profession. So it's interesting to me that in Chicago, the Art Institute, the citizens of Chicago, the robber barons, the people who were big collectors, they didn't start a museum. The first thing they did was they started a school. And the school came before the museum. And what's amazing, if you think about that, because most people would never think that, is that school was what was important. A living artist was what was important to Chicago, you know, in 1866 when it started. And then afterwards they said, oh, you know, we need a collection, so we better start a museum. And then the museum happened. But it wasn't the first thought. The first thought was living artists making work. And one of the problems for art schools is that people forget that the most important thing is the process of making objects. It's not the objects. And I remember for years talking to the trustees at the Art Institute of Chicago and saying, you know, you all love these objects and you support these objects, but these objects are made by artists, and without artists, you have no art. And that I had to say that all the time because the process gets absorbed into the object, and people commodify the object and they forget how it got there. And how it got there were places like the San Francisco Art Institute or the Art Institute of Chicago or Cooper Union or RISD or all the art schools that exist. So I always think of these places as holding environments, the way Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, talked about a safe environment where you could pursue your very complex thoughts of the unconscious and of dreams. Art schools have to be holding environments. They have to be structured, they have to be safe, they have to allow an enormous amount of creativity, but they also have to function. So that's where people like me come in, deans of art schools, and try to make this thing happen, which is this sort of wildness and radicality, but also so it can survive. And there are several, sort of a blend of creativity and structure, I think of it. But there are different models, and I'm just gonna say this all very quickly because I don't wanna take too much time, but there are two models really in some ways, or maybe three. One is the standalone art school, like the way that the San Francisco Art Institute or the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, they're standing outside of a major university. And then there's the school I am in now, Columbia University, which is an art school within a university research institution. And they're different. The standalone art school never has to justify the importance of art and artists. That's what it's about. Everybody agrees. That's why they're there. But an art school in a university has to position itself within all the other research models. So you have a medical school, a law school, a journalism school, and within all of that, and in Columbia there are 16 very impressive other schools, you have to justify why art and the making of art and the process of art is so significant. And you have to position it as research and as the development of new knowledge. And you never have to do that in a standalone art school because everyone's in agreement. So those things are really important. And the last thing I want to say, which has a lot to do with the struggle of art schools. People love art. They don't necessarily love artists, and they don't necessarily love the mess of making work and the experimentation and the cross-disciplinarity and the radicality and the confusions and the chaos and everything that goes with that creative process. And we're not a society that supports the making of art. We are a very utilitarian society. We don't understand that in not supporting those entities that actually are sources of creativity, we're really not supporting our own heart. We're so involved in what's functional that we forget that we can't function without art and culture, and therefore we don't help to support it. So it becomes very difficult, really a struggle for these institutions, whether they're standalone school or whether they're in universities where they have to compete against other entities to actually survive. So I'm gonna end it right there because my colleagues have less to say too. So I'll stop now.
Thank you, Carol. John?
Yes, thanks, Dory. First, thank you to the Brooklyn Rail, Catherine, Fong, the whole Rail team, and my panelists. And Dory, thanks for organizing this. And I look forward to hearing from Marie. So to your question, Dory, what would we lose? Are we sentimental? We would lose everything. We would lose culture. We would lose a life raft, as so many students have said. Art school saved my life. We would lose identity. We would lose the interrogation of culture, so much around culture. Psychogeography, there's so much we would lose. I like what you're saying, Carol, about the standalone art school. I wonder if there's a piece of that where we are kind of feeling like we have to justify it in a way because capitalism is pushing on us, and parents of the lessening 18-year-olds wanting to come to school, the parents are thinking about practicality. You know, can they make a living with being an artist? But I want to make it clear that I'm here speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the faculty at large. Just want to get that out the gate. So you can put me in check if I sound like I'm doing something else. But I also want to say the Art Institute is not defunct. It's not dead. It's, while I can't deliver to you facts of this many students are returning, it's eminent that they will be returning. There's so much energy and goodwill that's turning into the reality of the school opening and staying open. So my position, and I want to talk about it a little more once we get involved in the discussion, but I think what we've been learning in this time of online teaching, we've been learning about the pros and cons of that and how we can imagine new models and new modes of teaching. And the low residency model is a really good example of that. And I believe that it can be a less expensive model with a more intensive program. And it can really reach a very broad scope of students that can attend. So the last thing I want to say to kind of bait the discussion, I think what needs revamping or re-looking at is how we look at and deal with patronage and philanthropy, but not pedagogy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Dewey?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first I'd like to say that I am at this moment sitting on occupied land, and I am one of the occupiers of Ohlone territory. And I want to thank those ancestors for permitting me to do so. Secondly, I want to say that I am represented by Karen Jenkins Johnsons Gallery, one of the oldest African-American owned galleries in the country, magnificent thinker. And I'd also like to say that thank the Brooklyn Rail, Fong and Catherine and all, and also you, Dora, for inviting me to do this. And I'd also like to say that the Art Institute is not dead, not closing, that it is an institution that was born in the 19th century, a century that coined these terms like make it new and all of that. And the Art Institute came into being at that time and nurtured the city of San Francisco and people from around the country into a creative life. An institution that old, an institution that survived the earthquake of 1906. It survived and thrived and helped to bring the city back to life creatively. And it has not stepped off of that mission. While I have known that school since the 1960s, when I walked in the door as a student, frightened and ran across the bay and went to another very good school, but the Art Institute haunted me until I came back and was able to get my degree, undergraduate degree from there. And that institution nourished me, although I was at war with it, primarily because I made work which was political at a time that saw art for art's sake, and politics and art did not mix. And therefore, there was no possibility of your being really accepted as a political artist. And it also had problems. And one of the problems was the art history that was taught. I used to disturb the class asking if there had ever been any African-American artist as great as these artists, and they were great, that I am looking at in this black room with this blue glow of profound images being shot at me. And of course, the teacher would tell me, no, there haven't been. And the reason for that is because art is about quality, not about politics. That echoed through every school I've ever gone to. And I know that there are probably many African-American artists of my generation who can say the same thing. And therefore the pedagogy, which shaped art institutions in America, reinforced ideas that marginalized the ways in which African-American art was viewed. But the Art Institute also had this ability to drip, drip, drip onto your consciousness the importance of creativity and individuality. That the only way you can be in the world is to gain the knowledge necessary. And the Art Institute was certainly about that. And the skills that are commensurate with it, so that you could bring your voice deeply into the present. So the Art Institute is like a phoenix, and I know this is a cliche, but it's in order, because we are in hell right now with this COVID, and it re-emerges just like it's doing now, while it is reimagining itself, so that out of the burning comes this profound creativity that it has staked its claim on, and its board, its faculty, and its students above all rushed immediately into that tilted space on a hillside and lifted it up to maintain the creative principle that will be guided into the 21st century for another 150 years. So the Art Institute will be well. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you. And Gordon, you're our last speaker here.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity for all of us to get together and think about art schools, the role of art, and the nature of education, and the future of how these institutions work. Yes, the development of the institution of an art school is a key component to humanity. It's an essential part of how humans live and move forward, and it takes many, many different forms. The institutional higher ed structures that have been operating in the country for centuries are under extraordinary challenge right now, between COVID, technology, and the demand for an expanded awareness of diverse cultural perspectives as part of our system of teaching and learning has put pressure on all institutions. In the US, the smaller institutions are under incredible pressure. The model has really been broken. It's entangled with market forces. It has a tuition-based revenue model that is very hard to maintain. In some senses, there's archaic forms of structures and hierarchies. And the primary thing, of course, is that in the US, education is not considered a necessity that's supported by the government or by the society. It is really put on the backs of students. And so this model is in danger and is very difficult to move forward. What is useful and wonderful to remember is that the need to have deep human communication, the transfer of knowledge, is something that we've always done. So with the starting of my images, the first one there would be of Black Mountain College. And the concept there with Black Mountain College, as Carol alluded to, was the idea of new, start from the beginning, work with the idea of putting into the center of all knowledge and all inquiry, art and art making, a non-hierarchical open community designed to allow the inter-teaching from both students and faculty in every way. And in its 24 years, the Black Mountain College managed to assemble a impact through its students and its faculty that a school 150 years old would be proud of. So these models do work. This is an image of the supine dome that is what Elaine de Kooning called Buckminster Fuller's failed attempt to put up a geodesic dome. The next image is just a shot of the Black Mountain College. The faculty and students themselves built this, and it's become a model. And at this location now is a new school called the Alternative School, and it is based right there. They have summer programs. It's a nonprofit, and they do completely open, no credits, no prerequisites, and no certificates. But it's very much on that model. But the Black Mountain College has produced a number of models. Bruce High Quality Foundation University is one. Even the Manifesto Biennial in Europe was started with the idea of some of the philosophies behind Black Mountain College. The next is an image of Dartington, which is a college, experimental college started also in the 30s in the UK, very much following from the Bauhaus, very much open, an open forum where faculty and students were working together and connected deeply with nature. So these are three sort of images of structured institutions designed around the spirit of art and communication and flow. The fourth image is really what I want to start to explore is alternative approaches to the movement of ideas. This is the famous Wall of Respect in Chicago, 1967. And it was created by an organization, the Organization of Black American Culture, OBAC. And OBAC actually is a anagram that's also means chieftain in Yoruba. This is an example of teaching and learning, a community coming together to move ideas forward without any support from the institutional structures around it. But it was highly effective. Jeff Donaldson, who was one of the leaders of this, along with William Walker, went on to become to get his PhD from Northwestern and became the head of the art department at Howard University. So here's an example of sort of grassroots, organic, community-based educational forum that becomes, then moves into a structured forum at Howard. The next example is, again, this is Sun Ra, who was part of that entire Black Arts movement compound, but his program was to bring students together and musicians together and live in a compound and in a commune and have classes and work as literally a cohort of musicians working around the concept of the commune and the shared education and shared knowledge. And the next image is a similar sort of thing. This is the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music. And they started in 1969 and began right at the beginning to open a school, which is still going strong. They still have a very powerful school that works from K through 12, as well as the graduates there often become part of the AACM and continue to teach. Their main goal is to advance the careers and the creativity of their members, to develop a new generation of talent, and to maintain high moral standards as a role model for going forward. Again, another educational form that is not institutional. The next image is from, this is Mariettica Portrait, and she was teaching for about 8 years at the Hamburg University of Fine Art in Germany, and she would combine her classes and put them together, and as a group they would travel to different places or different spots to address local issues and assemble art projects, but also community-based projects. So this was based on project-based learning, apprenticeship mentoring, a group collaboration, and local collectives. The next image is their project in Soweto. Here they went down for 3 months, about 20 students. So again, it's under the form of a university, but it's actively engaged in the communities around the world. And they took an old dump and turned it into a park. And also in Soweto, they took a field and turned it into, next to a school, and turned it into a series of vegetable gardens that were part of the pedagogy of the school. And then the next one is the Arizona project, which these students came, they stayed at the Arizona State University's Combine Artist Residency, worked with local communities, as well as working with the arts group Post Commodity on the installation of repellent fence. Again, hands-on pedagogy on sort of a lateral level, and the clear intention that the movement of ideas and the assembly of sort of the liberation of inquiry and of community engagement are systems of learning and systems of moving ideas that are essential and can go both within and out of structural forms. The next image is a circle of yurts in Kyrgyzstan, which were waiting for a group of students this summer to have another project like that, connecting to healing, to agriculture and local farming, and to culinary techniques. It obviously didn't happen this year, but it's waiting for next year. But the point is that there are incredible models to examine as we look forward to new forms of education. And I think the challenges of institutions, especially small schools in the United States today, is it's a really a difficult, complicated model to work with. But the hope and the intention is to see how we can transform, how the creativity of an art school can actually turn out a new institution. And the idea, of course, and this is my last slide, is that, as Peter Cooper said, you know, the education really needs to be as free as air and water. And I think that we have to open up our possibilities and imagine other ways of assembling the transfer of knowledge generationally, laterally, and the empowerment of artistic inquiry. So that's sort of my optimistic look at what might be possible.
Great, thank you, Gordon, and thank you, all of the participants. Maybe one good place to start here, the discussion, is to think about pedagogy, because you're all talking about pedagogy in one way or another, particularly Dewey, who's suggesting you know, a kind of struggle that art school, he described his own, but I'm taking that as maybe a general way that not only students, but teachers use the art school to struggle with and against their own ideas, to struggle with other people, with the limitations of art history. As an art historian, I'm curious about this issue, Dewey, because I'm wondering, is the answer in your mind to introduce new artists, new models, new people to the structure we already have? Or are you suggesting a new way of teaching, and maybe by extension, a new way of thinking that needs to happen in the classroom? And I note that you started your discussion here by thanking people, and that seems like a new model right there, that may be a sort of Paulo Freire way of teaching where we reverse the power relationships. So I was curious if you could talk about what would make it a more vital classroom. Is it to introduce Black artists, artists who are not being discussed because they're not part of the canon, or is it to teach differently?
If you will permit me, I think that we have, first of all, I want to say that pedagogy is an essential aspect of development in an institution. And pedagogy just doesn't happen in a college. Pedagogy happens as a result of the pedagogy you get in college. It winds up shaping institutions like museums. The ideas that come from that pedagogy reinforces what goes on in society. If I might just take a trip back to get to the present, and I think that's always important, that in the beginning of the 20th century, when the great institution, MoMA, came to be the central modernist institution, led at first by Alfred Barr, they brought with them Europe. Barr wasn't so interested in just Europe, but Europe became the structure that they would bring into the 20th century to reinforce European ideas that were agent in the beginning of the 20th century into the world. Now, one of those became the signature marking painting of the 20th century, the early 20th century particularly, and that was Picasso's La Demoiselle de Davignon. Now that picture was framed in primitivism. The whole pedagogical language around it was that this painting was Picasso appropriating not only European material from where he came, the Three Graces, all of the profound things that had shaped him as a maker. But when Picasso, as well as other European artists at this time, came in contact with African intelligence, they were so overwhelmed, him particularly, that the experience of this intelligence reshaping how you could view time and space through the process of making an image, to use an archetype which everybody in the world uses in order to reshape your understanding of form. Picasso recognized it. Picasso, like any artist who is trying to understand a profound moment of shock for him, because it answered a question he was after, to change from a static notion of making to a multi-layered way of working. And so he used that African work to break from the European tradition. And he carried it forward in a profound way. And the museum used it as a framework for modernism without speaking directly to the impact and importance of African intelligence. So that when it was framed in primitivism, therefore it was following the same ideology that was shaping colonialism. And that way of shaping, as pedagogy does, traveled throughout the 20th century, reinforcing this notion. And when I came to New York in 2003, and I've been coming to New York since I was a young person, so I've been there many times, and that museum has been a beacon for me. That I heard Kurt Vonnegut, one of the greatest curators in the history of MoMA, describe Ladamos, Davignon, and Picasso's engagement as a savage intervention. Now, this is a brilliant person, bringing the 19th century into the 21st century. That's what pedagogy does. He didn't say this. He said this as a way to be transgressive, not as a racist, but it was a racist use of the term. Now, certainly, if he was here today, he would never use such language. But all of that way of framing comes from pedagogy. That's why we are on the precipice right now of developing a new approach to pedagogy, one that does not permit a singular ideology, that all roads of its pedagogy lead to Greece and Rome, that the dynamics of contemporary life requires the entire world, and the entire world is engaged in this idea of coming and froing. So therefore, pedagogy is opening up, is becoming, recognizing more, but it's the only way to reshaping this pedagogy is the only way we can move into the 20th century without the disruption like what we have going on now, this recurring need to refocus us on something that was shaped to make America or the world great again, according to that model from the 20th century. It cannot stand. And fortunately, places like the Toot And like many of the things Gordon just cited, and Carol and other pedagogists, we can really get a handle on what plagued me all through my educational experience. And so I know I sound emotional here, but pedagogy is essential because I was bathed in it. I learned to love it. I take it deeply seriously. And I think these kinds of interventions is the holy grail of a particular kind of knowledge, and that knowledge has to open up. And I think that courageous people are on that mission. That's all I have to say.
Carol, do you have anything on that topic to say about, I feel like all of you do, and thank you so much, Dewey. I think you got to the heart, really, of what we're talking about here, which is, you know, what needs to happen or what can happen, and turning around a century or two of, or more, of pedagogy is really what we're talking about here, and opening it up. And I know all of you've talked about it. John, I know pedagogy is really very important to you as well. And Carol, you and just on that note, John, you had done the low residency MFA, so I want to add that. And Carol, you talked about the process, the artist process, and Gordon showed images to give history to that. So do you three have something to add? Carol?
Dewey, that was amazing. That was amazing. You just brought back so much history and so much thinking. I think one of the things we need to talk about a little bit about what art schools bring into the world is they also bring in, and to Dewey's point, I mean, they bring in amazing theoretical models that a lot of the unthinking, which had to happen, and rethinking that had to happen about this entire history that Dewey is talking about really comes from the push of art schools for multiplicity of points of view and decentering the subject and de-Europeanizing the subject, and all those conversations that have, and globalizing the subject, which conversations that have been happening in art schools for decades, because they are places of radicality. They can break through. They're not, interestingly, for all of the embedded assumptions, they're not hierarchical in the same way, which means that young artists push on these institutions, I promise you, very hard to change. And they push because they see the world shifting and they want the pedagogy to align with their generation. And that has to do with technology, that has to do with new ideas about race and culture and thinking about gender and everything. And every day, these places are generating new ideas. And I think it's important to note that art is about ideas. And we don't always talk about it that way, but it truly is about ideas. It's an embodiment of historical, cultural moments in moving through the subjective that Dewey was talking about. Because one of the things that's truly radical about art pedagogy is that it's focused on the individual and subjectivity as it relates to the collectivity. So that's really radical, because in other kinds of education, there's whole bodies of knowledge that you're supposed to ingest and then put back out into the world before you get to say anything. Like, you have to show that you've internalized all of that, and then you get to talk. But art schools are like, say it, just do it. And that's what artists do, and that's why they can break through barriers, oftentimes being very unorthodox, sometimes being super obnoxious, but really shifting paradigms very quickly. So to your original question of why are these institutions important? They're important because they break through the solidity of culture. They're much more permeable to change. And were there to be one class that I think everyone should take who goes to art school or is even interested in art, it wouldn't be just the history of art. It would be the history of the place of art and artists in society. So what was art doing? And in all societies, not just in one society. So what was the function of art? What is the function of art what was the function at different moments in multiple societies. And then we could really start to talk about what artists do. So I'm going to stop there.
Right on, Karen.
So
Oh, right on from Dewey. Thank you.
don't all be jealous. Dewey's my colleague, everybody. So imagine that. It's amazing. So when I was saying pedagogy doesn't need to be revamped or reimagined, I'm making the big assumption that pedagogy is doing exactly what Dewey is saying. And I know it's not perfect, right? But my experience, my personal experience of what is being taught is much along the lines of what Carol is saying. There's a lot of pushback from students. Students are active. They are the new generation. I learn from them. They learn from me, I would hope. And what I'm saying needs to be revamped is the philanthropy. Who is able, how can we get people with the money to support this structure? And I've noticed some questions in the chat of saying, you know, I can't even join the conversation because you're not addressing the cost. That's a tough one. That's really tough. But that's why, you know, I don't have ideas on directly how that can happen. Small art schools are under siege with that. Even ones with large endowments, but that's maybe diverting the topic here, but that's what I want to add in there. Oh, one last thing. What I have seen in the low residency model is that I'm not saying it's a better way to study, but the intensity that brings and what it allows people to keep, how it allows people to keep their life, their job, etc. It brings an intensity of study that is really vital. And I've seen some amazing work come out of that program.
I'd love to follow up on that because actually it's the idea of the decentralized, the transformation of the concept of residency that is one of the opening possibilities for the continuation of what art schools do. It seems the conversation really has been about what we might lose with art schools is the role of what art does and the role of what education does. It's really been the content that we've been focusing on, and that is exactly right. And to answer Carol's question, I've always thought of the role of art as that particular component of human activity, of cultural activity, that allows for questions, that is actually open to questions. I mean, the example of it's the jester in the court that actually can call the king's bluff. And it is precisely being given that permission to go out and dive in deep, understand well, and ask questions precisely and present information, revealing the invisible that art does. And art therefore provides humanity with the ability to adapt. You simply are not going to be able to change your culture if you can't ask questions around the edges. And that's what art does. So I would sum up by saying art really provides adaptability to the human species, and that's really what it does. The school, the art school, the institution to help encourage, inspire, and advance this type of deep inquiry and this type of deep communication is a form that every single culture has and every single culture needs, and it works in multiple different ways. There's apprenticeships, there's internships, there are processes of cohorts of age groups, you know, working together around ideas with leaders. And there are, of course, the institutional forms that we have in America today. Higher ed in the US is in really a crisis mode. It's partially because of the way it's been set up, and it is entirely recognized through the cost. The cost of going to school is unbearable. And it is because higher ed in the US is completely tangled up with the market models and the market economy. It is unbelievable to imagine that we are actually taking value out of the future of our students and taking that money now in the form of student loans, which is going to hobble them going forward. There isn't a species on the planet that does that to its next generation. It's really the market out of control has created institutions that can no longer sustain what they're trying to do and what they should do, which is why I'm very excited about the application of creativity to the institution itself. We know that society needs art. We know that society needs to teach art and learn art and share art and encourage that inquiry. We just don't have a form that makes it possible. And that's why these alternative models are so interesting to me. The idea of the low residency, the idea of being able to move around, the idea of being, as Carol pointed out, embedded within a larger institution, that therefore that institution provides the financial stability. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to come up with new models, and we need to have them understood, and they need to be built off of organic forms that have worked in the past. And I think that the types of examples, the AACM is really an amazing example of an institution that has been advancing improvisation and creativity in the sonic and the visual arts, and also applying that same sort of investigation, inquiry, and improvisation to the structural form of the institution itself. This is the type of full loop that I think we need, and I think we have really big questions to ask about what is the form of art pedagogy going forward. There's no doubt that it's needed.
Well, Catherine, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, John, Carol, Dewey, these great conversation. I want to open it up to the questions people are putting on the chat. There's a lot happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank all of you for this really enlightening conversation. Seems really super important and relevant right now. So we have a lot of questions. As you can see, a lot of people are asking about the financial accessibility. Jamie Braden had first brought it up, and maybe you guys could keep addressing that. But we also have another question sort of related from Marie Shirkus, who had to leave, but maybe she can watch this later. And that is smaller size part of the future of art schools? And she said that a year or so ago, small art schools were trying to figure out how they were going to survive, as it became clear that a population of 18-year-olds entering college that was expected to drop drastically in the next 4 to 5 years. And many of the amazing projects that Gordon shared were possible because of smaller communities. So sort of related to that is a smaller size part of the future of art schools. And I guess that is sort of related to financial accessibility. So if each of you could address those two topics, that would be fantastic. Carol, you want to go first?
I'm not sure. I mean, everyone's asking, I know in the chats, I'm not looking at the chats because it distracts me, but every now and then it comes across. Everyone's really concerned about the finances, and I spend my life worrying about this too. And to Gordon's point, I mean, so many of these wonderful models are no longer here, like Black Mountain or even Dartington. I mean, and it's because it's so expensive. It's so difficult to structure an environment where you have the tools that you need to make work, you have the fabrication, you have the technology, all the stuff that people want and need. And you have the faculty, and things become institutionalized. So Black Mountain has to go, because in order to be a radical institution, it had to dissolve. It couldn't go on the way it was because it was not viable financially or even structurally. So many of those amazing artists who were there went on to just do their own work. They didn't want to run that place forever. And the minute you institutionalize a place, you have enormous expense. So I don't know if it's a question of small versus larger, or even being within a larger institution. I think it's to what Gordon said, the whole model of higher education needs to be rethought, and art schools are part of that model. It's going to be that transformation or that rethinking of how do people get knowledge, how do you transmit from one generation to another, is going to have to be rethought. And some of these new prototypes are going to help rethink that. But whether we can ever take the models that exist and ever raise enough money from wealthy donors to solve it, I don't think so. I think we're going to have to think much bigger and much more radically about the future than that. So I'm just going to throw that out and let other people pick that up.
Well, I think that's right. I think it's absolutely true. This is a inflection point in many different ways, and I think one of the challenges that the schools are facing now is that students are wondering what's the value of the education. There's a real examination of the return on investment when you realize, I mean, students today are looking at the generation before them postponing, making their families, postponing houses, postponing, life careers because they are saddled with debt. And the question is, with many models out there now, Silicon Valley being one of them, there is a real recognition that it's a DIY world. You can do it yourself. You can figure out what you need to do. There is incredible amount of information available on the internet, and there's ways to actually rally that and turn it into action without having to go through $120,000 4 years in debt. So the model is changing. It has to change. But the requirement, the essential human need to be able to exchange ideas, transfer knowledge, pool intellectual capacities, and collectively assemble new ways of thinking about what it is we're doing and how we're doing it, that will go on, and that has to go on. And I think we're going to see models coming up where there are things such as maybe shorter term, 2-year degrees or certificates or apprenticeships, and I think Minerva is a model that's out there that's interesting. They don't have a location. They have 8 different sets of prearranged dormitories in 8 different cities across the world, and over the course of 4 years, a single cohort will live in all 8 places for 6 months, and their pedagogy and curriculum is all delivered online. So the coffee shop in New Delhi is their classroom for 6 months. That's an interesting model. Rax Media Collective, they put together some wonderful thoughts on the nature of education, and they were really talking about how there's 3 components. There is duration, the time component, the time it takes to actually spend time learning and thinking. There's the gathering form, the collective group together, the forum, and then there's the place, the place for learning. And their argument is of these 3, it's really time that's the most important. And so how we spend that time, how we put together time with a group to share ideas and to move ideas forward is can take many, many forms. And it really does not have to cost the amount that it does, the way it does. And the other key thing is places where education works is where it's centrally supported, where it's understood. You do not raise a next generation by having them do it themselves. You have to put effort into it. Everybody does it. Every species does it. That's how generations move. So I think models are going to emerge from the potential, but I think the requirement to have forms of knowledge and forms of education take place will drive us to new models and new forms.
So looking at Carol, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to throw this in to further complicate the conversation. People also come to art school for the launch, the professional part of getting the work out into the world. And my school has 4 different forms in film and writing, theater and visual art. And a lot of what is frustrating students right now with the COVID nightmare is that launch, that next step out into the world isn't happening. And it's causing enormous frustration. And so I'm not so sure about online education for artists, honestly. I have not seen happiness being brought to us by this form right now, but also the world that we're in, this strange moment of suspension, is also incredibly frustrating for students who feel like they've made this investment and now the next step isn't happening. So part of what we're up against is that art schools are part of a whole ecology that is not just the art school, but it's everything around it and all the systems around it. Not that we're going to solve that in this conversation, but I think as we think of it, we should think of it contextually. It doesn't exist alone.
So if I can jump in, I'm not ready to give up degree program granting institutions, but I'm definitely interested in augmenting that. I think perhaps that is an issue in many art schools, that they're not looking at additions of certificate programs or residencies that can all work together with a degree granting mode. That it's along the lines of what you're saying, Carol, that degree launches so many things, and not necessarily just that rite of passage with an MFA or a BFA exhibition and the physicality of that. But I think that's what needs to happen now, and I'm hopeful that the reimagining that's happening probably in a lot of schools and certainly with SFAI, that's something that the school's really looking at. And I know I'm pushing for that myself, for the school to hang on to the accreditation and to the degree granting mode.
Can I say something?
Please.
Well, I have to go back in time. I don't know anything about how the money situation gets to, how to deal with students like that. I'm not involved in administration, but I do realize that what you do in the society as a whole has consequences, and there are ripple effects. And in order to understand where we are now, you have to go to the past. And in the 1980s, a new mindset came into being in America. And that mindset was reinforced by decisions that people made, deflected by shiny stuff that made them think that this was going to help them. And the first thing they lost was unions. Now, unions help to shape and create the middle class in America. Power, and when we talk about art, we are talking about power. Art has power, and therefore power uses art to serve it. And it has done that for as long as human beings have been on the planet. They use art to reinforce ideas that relate to their power. And therefore, when society got tripped up in the notion of making a deal or making America great again, they bought into a system that used something called free market enterprise and something really important, which was the use of a Laffer curve that said rising boats lift all, rising tides lift all boats. Well, they do if you're in a boat, but if you're not in a boat, a tsunami is what greets you. And that's what greeted the American people, particularly Black people, who were used to these tricks. So they saw it immediately. But because the culture as a whole bought into this, unionization began to crumble. Free market systems took over the country and the world. And therefore, everything moved into do it for yourself. If you don't do it, it won't be done. If you don't take advantage of what's available, it's your fault. That ideology really permeated most of the late 20th century at the same time that art was involved in this money trap, which made it believe that art and money hung out together. And it fed a particular kind of ideology in America. And that has helped to, that is one of the dimensions that reinforces our not paying attention to some of the things we did, like voting. And we wind up with people who hustle our deep beliefs. And now we're in the same situation all over again, because art does something very important, and it's too bad the system of art training doesn't happen more. And it teaches you how to see, how to experience, how to see. And you can extrapolate from that micro drawing relationship to how to see through something, because the whole point of drawing is an observational technique that you learn to look deeply into something. Well, once you learn how to do this, this is applicable to life. You can also look deeply at when tricks are being shot at you to make you relieve yourself of money by voting for tax reliefs that are really designed to help the wealthy and not you. And so many of the parents who unfortunately, like me and others, voted for people who continue to create this mania that takes from the body of people to give to a 1%. And the arts, unfortunately, have become victims of this 1%ism. It cost me, as a student in 1968, $350 a semester to go to the Art Institute. That's a shame. $350, and it was difficult to get that. So I think that this money problem removes a generation of future intellects that can help us work our way through complicated problems in the future. But not having access to schools is horrible. And every time I look at these students and the burden that they have, it hurts your heart, because you know that somebody else is relieved of the possibility. And therefore something has to be worked out. And whether or not it is apprenticeships again, or these special places, art is going to happen regardless. Regardless, it's going to happen. But arts education, we have to fight for politicians to reinforce and bring relief to institutions so that everybody in this country has the opportunity to shine as human beings. And that's why you have to vote. You have to, I'm going right to the key. You got to vote for the people who you think, I know that can be a trick, but you got to pay attention and vote for people who are going to do something about this neoconism, which is taken over the creative world. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Try to follow that up, somebody.
Also, what I was saying is that, you know, you have to put the whole thing within a historical, political context. You can't just see it as a problem as art school problem. It's a gigantic social problem that we're confronting. So thank you. And thank you for ending with vote.
Right.
So important right now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Molly Hankwitz, who I will pass a mic to now. Just one moment. Okay. So Molly doesn't seem to be responding. So we will go, oh, Molly, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, but I'm confused as to my question. I lost track of the chat, sorry.
Oh, okay. Would you still like to ask a question?
Well, I guess it was sort of brought up, I think, by Carol, that it's not just the art school alone. I think this is such an important, to remember context, because it seems to me that, part of, if we're going to critique pedagogy and critique this, is to look at what artists are expected to do in society. I mean, the role of the artist will also change once again as a result of these unprecedented times. So I guess that was my question. What is society asking artists to do and to become, and what role are they being asked to play in the future? When we have an administration that the last place that they've given any stimulus to has been higher education, or now the public school systems. We have in our society, it's like flipped, because we don't have a government an administration that made first and foremost the message to the society: higher education needs support. Forget it. Nobody, that's not where the money went. Stimulus went. And what are artists, art students graduating, are they just being asked to plug in to be sort of functionaries in the capitalist art market? I mean, I guess it's just not the schools alone, it's outside of the schools. I think, I'm asking if anyone could respond to that or had thoughts about that. Thank you. Thank you.
Carol.
I can say something. I'm sure everyone wants to talk to this one. There's a fantastic phrase in Althusser, that philosopher, that it's called, he says, talks about rupture in the continuity. And that's what's happened right now. We're in a rupture of everything we assumed life was going to be. Every generation is caught in this right now. And something has to come out of this that's different, or else it's been in vain, all of it. So I really am hoping that that incredible time that's spent cultivating the individual in art school, working on what is it that individual people have to say, now has to go back into the collective. How does that all fit into the collective? And that has to be part of the pedagogy, I think, going forward. That, the uniqueness of cultivating the person, so the person can be truly effective in the world, and that the concept of action has to be linked to art, because I really think we don't have much time now. And I say that not just because of the election, but I say that because of the planet. And if we don't come out of this understanding what we do to the planet, and that our elected officials are further damaging and threatening human life, because we will have nowhere to be. If we don't come out of this with people understanding that, then we have wasted this opportunity. Where artists come into that is enormous, because artists can talk to all of it in any way that they choose, in any way, in any form that they choose. Because what art can do that almost nothing else can do is it gets people to respond emotionally in the deepest part of their heart to things. That isn't just the mind. You don't change people with just the brain. That's why when the new head of the Earth Institute came to Columbia, the first person, really, he said to me, you are the first person I'm seeking out, because we don't know how to message enough. We need artists to message around climate change, because you guys know how to do that. So that's what I see. That's what I hope. It's my biggest hope. And everything else then follows, because we just got to change the way we're approaching the world. We can't go on in every way, in higher education, in the planet, the way we deal with race, everything has got to be rethought. And this is a moment to do it. So I'm staying utopian. I'm believing that this is possible.
Well put, Carol.
Can I say that Gordon showed Sun Ra, and Sun Ra said space
is the place.
When he said space is the place, it is like art is a absolute metaphor for the micro you. The space is also the space between your ears. And that right there is animative of the space you occupy. So Sun Ra gave you a key to absolutely step into your space. And that's what art schools do. They get you ready for space, the space between your ears.
I mean, what can artists do? They need to make art. So we make art. That's what artists can do. But I'm seeing all this, and you know, how can society change to support that? I mean, any artist is going to tell you what, if faced with that question, what should I do? I'll make art. But society maybe isn't I don't know. This is a tough one.
Politics.
I would say, Molly, answering the question of what are artists expected to do, I think it's not what they're expected to do, but it's what both Dewey and Carol have been pointing out. It's what they're capable of doing. They're actually, to engage in learning and understanding and making art is to be profoundly connected to the deepest sort of forms of human cohesion. And so the shift from the market, I mean, the absolute horrific colonization of art and art making by the market, and turning, you know, these galleries and auctions into hugely uncontrolled financial instruments is precisely what we don't need to do. And what is possible, and what a good arts education will give you, is a huge sense of being able to look, just as Dewey was saying, the ability to, that deep inquiry that allows you to see when somebody's throwing something at you that's not good for you. Being able to make the right decisions as to who to vote for and why. These are all talents and skills that come from the inquiry of art making and art education. And the other part, as Carol brought out, is this profound human form of communication. There's nothing deeper that we can possibly do in terms of recognizing our interconnection than to feel connected from the heart and from the head and from the emotions in a way that almost can't be put into a linear line of text. So it's not so much what artists are asked to do, it's what you're capable of. You guys are capable of, and it is the right time to be out there looking, seeing what you see and communicating what you communicate, and demanding the utopia that Carol still believes in and that I think is possible. We have to demand that, and we have to know that we know it when we see it, and we need to make it real, and that's what artists can do.
Thank you so much. Our final question and comments come from Fong Bui, our publisher. Fong, you should be able to activate your mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dory, for being the moderator, John, and, you know, Gordon, Dewey, and my friend Carol. This is terrific. It's absolutely absorbed through all your perspective. And I was thinking, it is true that we acknowledge this time as the most profound time. In fact, it's not that dissimilar what we know, how we survived through the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time when the government was so involved. I mean, we know that through the WPA, through the federal, for the art, for theater, for music, and all the public programming. And it was through the arts and the humanity that really saved the soul of the people. The way that we experienced in the Renaissance, why it was called Renaissance, rebirth, leading after Black Death in 1348. And it's one of those periods that we know the mobilization of the arts and humanity will rise again, and that will change it. And at this time around, there are so many, you know, social, political problems that have been kept under the rug for so long. So now it had to all come out together. And I feel this is where artists have a very special place to play, important role to play. I've been reading Hannah Arendt's great book edited by her secretary, my friend Jerome Cohen. and thinking about her phrase, her dictum, thinking without the banister. You know, how can we walk? This is the role that the artists do best. You know, thinking without the banister. Can you walk up and down the staircase, thinking freely without having reliance on the handrail? And then we talk about earlier of references to Black Mountain College, and I never forgotten it. The only, it is, you're right, it's only 23 years in existence, but the impact it had is significant. And I know that it's true. Why is only Black American artists were invited to teach there, namely Jacob Lawrence. Right. You know, he was invited by Joseph Elber to teach in the summer 46. And I always never forgot what he said in that letter. When he wrote to Albert, he said, my belief is that it is most important for artists to develop an approach and philosophy about life. If he has developed this philosophy, he does not put paint on canvas, he put himself on the canvas. And I think that's not dissimilar to what Charlie Parker, who say later when somebody asked him whether he can, you know, define jazz in one sentence, he said, yes, it's very easy. You don't live it, it won't come out your horn. It's very interesting because, yeah, I think that when we last interviewed Tony Eisler last Friday, he suggested that we should try to defund the fund in police and put it in education. And that would be immense help. So that's if we get to vote, that will be a condition which we must mobilize very fast. But to your point too, about Sun Ra. Sun Ra came to New York in early 50s, and it was Jonas Makers who had just barely created Film Culture magazine, and it was Jonas who gave him his first performance at Charles Theater. And it's what we're lucky now, which we can't replicate the model of what Jonas and his so-called bohemians, counterculture folks are doing. Exactly, so healthy, cross-pollination, where poetry, painting, you know, and other art form can really coexist. Right. That ended by the time I came to New York in the late 80s. It was super frustrating. There was few older members alive. Jonas only passed away last February at the age of 96. So you can imagine what being replicated similarly right now is through the artist residency. You know, okay, there's famous people like Jasper Johns, who actually gone to Black Mountain College. And the first thing he wanted to, when he made money, was in 1964, created his foundation, the Foundation of Contemporary Art. And that initially were created in order to support his friends, you know, Merce Cunningham, John Cage. And that spread out is now one of the great artists foundation, and others to follow just what Jasper has done. And I'm taking a small example to go back to how art school is so important. When you think about, we interviewed recently Julie Moretu and Sasha Sikanda. We haven't welcomed Carol Walker yet, but imagine that 3 amazing artists came out from RISD in the short period of 3 years overlap. And I know that Carol had worked for Carol at Columbia Graduate School. She's now at Rutgers. But my point is that the more inclusion of Black African-American artists and color artists are essential into that mix. But take someone like Julie Moretu, who rose to fame, were able to create an artist residency. It's called Dennison Hill. It's upstate. And she did it with 2 other fellow artists. One is Bo Fleishhacker, and the other is Lauren Chua. So we talk about one, you know, essentially Filipino American born, and the other one is Chinese American born. So they're that, but they do not want to do it in a way that would mandate the institutionalized model. They want to do in their own terms. And to your point, Gordon, the so-called art residency that created by artists should work with different schools in order to tighten up that continuity, that relationship. So it doesn't have to be always been so incredible insular and narrowly kept within each institution. And I think that's a crisis we go through right now because none of us are working together.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so anyway, that's my comment come out from what you all have said. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Fong, for putting all this together. The Brooklyn Rail is a real, absolute joy for the entire world that has access to it. And this, what you have done with this weekly series, or all of these hundreds of presentations, while I'm in my studio working, I've had the pleasure of hearing many of these profound moments of artists speaking their own truth. You have provided that. That is one of the most important things, I think, that has happened in the 21st century, because those future art historians will be able to access your presentations and hear some of the most important thinkers who develop some of the ideas that will flow through the 21st century. So I want to commend you. And I want to say just one thing, that when I saw your involvement with Philip Guston, an artist that I revere, that panel you put together, I said, you know, if I ever come to New York and see him on the streets, I'm going to tell him thank you for that Philip Guston hit. And now I agreed to do this because she said Fong was going to be hosting it. And I told her that Fong was the hippest art person I had seen on the art scene. And let me just be clear on hip, Fong. When I say hip, I mean it like Charlie Parker and all them meant it, which means you are 360 degrees hip.
Wow.
Meaning you have 360 degrees of knowledge and you can move in any direction. And that's why your personality profoundly touches all of us. So your song, my man, has been inspirational to me in this room, and I know hundreds of people around the country who have tuned in to your spirit.
Dewey, help me not to get deported, okay?
Well, brother, you can believe I will be right there in if they don't do it before COVID's over, I will be right there. Going to war with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, John, Carol. And
thank you. Thank all of you at the book.
Thank you, everyone. This was such a touching conversation. And I guess what I learned from it is that we don't have to invent new models. I think we have models. We need to extend them. We need to get them out into the world and make sure that they have influence in other spheres.
Right.
And so thank you, Fong. Thank you, The Rail, Carol, John, Dewey, and Gordon, and Catherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think this is a wonderful moment to go over to our tradition of our poem. At The Rail, we have a tradition of ending all our lunches with a poem. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Marie Buck. Marie Buck is the author of Portrait of Doom, Good Night, Marie, May God Have Mercy on Your Soul, and Unresolved Mysteries, which is forthcoming from Roof this September, so be on the lookout for that. She's also the managing and web literary editor at Social Text. Marie, I will pass you a mic now.
Hi. Thank you so much for that amazing discussion. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, I think so.
Uh-oh.
Like I'm having a tech delay and I just want to make sure
Oh, I see you now.
you can hear me first. Catherine, can you give me a thumbs up if I'm audible?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. The video was lagging a bit, but I think you're good now. Seems like we're having a little bit of a tech problem. Just hold tight while we get our poet back on. Let's see.
I just want to say that why Catherine is trying to fix our technical problem here, that we are booked our program until November 2nd. So that's the day before the election. So more good news to come with all our political, social activists joining, along with artists and poets friends. So back to you. Are we good? So
Yeah, I think I'm back.
Yeah, Marie. Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Okay. Oh, it's okay. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks. I think, yeah, can I go ahead and start? I missed it.
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. So this poem is called The Dead, and it's part of a manuscript that's forthcoming in from Roof in a couple of weeks. The Dead. All we're going to do after the revolution is document the lives of the dead. Not the dead we already know about, but the dead we don't know about. We're going to take Jeff Bezos' money, and we're going to document ourselves and our pets, all our affections, our quotidian habits. We're going to document street cats that we didn't take in because we already had pets. We're going to document, on behalf of our pets, all the toys that our pets liked and accidentally destroyed. And maybe socialism will unveil something. Maybe Jeff Bezos' money will mingle with his blood and create an effect. Maybe socialism will undo our deadness so that we might animate our archives and interact as the things we left behind. Me, for instance, as a Katamari ball of poems, but mostly emails facilitating the publication of academic articles, i.e. my day job, of bills paid, of bizarrely intimate texts with people met online, of graduate school papers about poetry I no longer like, of an embarrassing and neurotic Google history that wonders at various ages about the health of my bowels, the relative attractiveness of my genitals, the addictions of family and friends, and how to find memes that I can no longer find, and about how Pasolini was killed, about the etiquette for sending sympathy notes. So that is the body that would get picked back up, and I could go around and find the others, the archives of my friends and lovers and pets from across time. Dogs, I would pet them. I would find the goldfish that got trapped at the top of the fish tank and cooked under the light. And when I had gotten used to things a bit and was ready, I would find my loves across time, here in the form of animated G-chats. I'd suck on the shoulders of the G-chats. I'd be really toppy with them. I'd leave them for my friends, and my friends and I would tease each other about our archive bodies, about the things we'd Googled, the way our texts fit together to create new versions of our mouths. Let's take Jeff Bezos' money and use it to live forever. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marie. And thank you, Dory. Thank you, Gordon and John and Dewey and Carol for this conversation today. Please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for more poetry. We will be starting a series called the Radical Poetry Readings, and tomorrow is the first of those, curated by Mahogany Brown, which we're very excited about. So please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. And you can now activate your mics if you would like to say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you,
so
Catherine.
much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Fawn.
for-
Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Dory.
Thank you,
Oh,
Fawn.
Marie.
Thank you so much, Dewey.
Dewey, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
Hey, Leonie.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey,
Thanks so much
Nina,
for your
John.
time, Carol.
Hey, Mom.
Thank you, everyone.
Rachel.
Thank you.
Utopia forever.
Oh,
Sophia Carol.
Carol, like in the weekend. Is that
Hi, John.
Hey, Leonie.
It's great to see you, man. John.
Thanks.
hi?
Thank you so much.
Hey, John and
Bye.
Nina. How's Iceland?
Thank
That's nice.
you.
Good to see you here, John.
Hey,
Hi,
bye.
Helen Ann. How are you?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get started. Sending love and courage for now, you all.
Bye. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you,
Right.
Fong.
Uh,
Thank you, Brooklyn.
Bye.
X.
Bye.